Hi, what I'm going to do here is give you a brief introduction to developing a consuming application for SData feeds. For the purposes of this demo, I'm going to be using something called the Sage Integration Framework to make my life a lot easier. The Sage Integration Framework, or SIF for short, is a .NET implementation of the SData standard. You can download both the source code and the installable version of the SIF from the GitHub repository. I'll provide a link at the end of the video. For full details on the SData standard itself, you can get that from sdata.sage.com. Again, I'll post a link at the end of the video. The SIF is also installed with a number of Sage applications. For the purposes of the demo today, I'll be using Sage 50 Counts 2012 version as the provider. If you are interested in learning more about creating a providing SData feeds, then there are another series of videos on that subject, and again I'll have links at the end of the video for that for anybody who's interested. What I've got on this machine here at the moment, I've got Visual Studio 2010 Professional Edition. To follow through this demo, you don't need the Professional Edition. You can use the Express Edition should you have that available, or even earlier versions of Visual Studio as well. I have also installed a helper tool, a plugin for Visual Studio, which we'll be using. Again, I'll have a link to where you can download that at the end of the video. So we'll get started. So I'm just going to create a new project here. I'll create a console application and just keep things nice and simple. We don't need anything particularly complex. I'll just open up Solution Explorer here first of all. What I'll do firstly is I'm going to right click on the project, and we'll see this item here, add SData reference. So this is the provided by the plugin that I mentioned earlier on. So you'll only see that if you've actually installed the plugin. If you've just installed the SIF, you won't see that. All this will really do though is generate us a lot of boilerplate code that we would otherwise have to type ourselves. So it's a nice little labour-saving device, and I'd certainly recommend that you download and install it if you're going to be developing SData feeds. So if I click on Add SData Reference, it will start up a little wizard. So just click Next. So what I need to do here is give it a name and at least one path to a schema file. For the name, I'm going to call it GCRM. GCRM, Global CRM Contract. This is a well-known and well-defined contract. It's been in use in a number of Sage applications for a number of years now. That's one of the reasons why I'm using it for the demo. You can actually call this anything you like. It doesn't really make any difference. I'm just going to call it GCRM here just to remind me what it is. And then we can either give it a path to a local schema file, so an XSD file that you have stored on your hard drive, or we can give it the path to a URL which a provider has given us. So I'm just going to use that second option here. I'm just going to paste it in. As you can see there, we're going to the local machine to the SData endpoint for accounts 50 GCRM, and we're issuing a $schema request. You can actually view that in a web browser if you want to have a look, and all it actually does is returns an XSD file, the same thing that you might have had stored locally on your hard drive. So if I click Finish there, it will try and connect to that, so it will need me to log on. So I'll just provide the default credentials, and what it's doing here is it's going off and reading that schema file, and it's generating, as we can see, a lot of boilerplate code here for us. So in addition to the classes that it's generated, it's also added a number of references, as we can see here in the Solution Explorer. So you can see it makes the reference to Sage Common Syndication, Sage Integration Client, Sage Integration Server Model, and Sage Utilities. And they're all assemblies which are part of the SIF and will be installed into the global assembly cache. And for ease of adding a reference to yourself, if you're not using the the Visual Studio plugin. They're also installed to C program files, Sage assemblies, SData. But if you're using the Visual Studio plugin, it's all automated. You don't really need to worry about that. So here we can see we've got a folder called SData references. We've then got within that a folder called GCRM. That's what I called the SData reference that I added. And then within here we have the generated files, and just a reminder not to modify them. As you can see here, we've got quite a lot of classes. These are all different types which have been defined in the GCRM contract. In this particular instance, it's the instance schema of Sage Accounts 50 that has got these definitions in there. And if I just open up one of these, so we'll just have a look at bank account, and I'll just give us a bit more room here. What we can see, we've got a public class here, called bank account feed entry schema. That inherits from this class feed entry, which is in the Sage Common Syndication namespace. Feed entry is a base class defined in the SIF, and you'll find that all of the classes here are exactly the same. They all inherit from feed entry, and you'll find later on when we use the SIF to make requests to the SData feeds that we are using generics, and when we're doing that, everything that we use must derive from feed entry or a feed, and I'll show you the feed class in just a moment. If we just expand the properties, you want to scroll down a little bit just so you can see it. What we can see here is there's a lot of properties defined, and there's a lot of metadata for each of those properties, including the label, whether it's nullable, what namespace it's in, so on and so forth. The properties themselves and that metadata has come directly from the schema. This has all just been generated. You don't really need to worry much about this at all. It's just so I show you here for information to see what you're actually getting. We'll just deal with these as an object. So we'll just create a new instance of a bank account, and we'll use the name property and the reference property and so on, and you'll see that in just a moment. So there's no implementation in here. They are very simple classes. Literally just every property of every type which is defined in the schema has been code generated here. If we pop back to Solution Explorer, I'll just collapse up the feed, and what you'll also see here now is that we have a feeds folder as well, and in there we've got exactly the same types which are defined in there, but these are the feeds. So a feed entry is a single instance of the resource, and a feed is a collection. So if we go and have a look at what's been generated here, you can see this is even simpler, and you can see the generics at play here actually. We have a public class called bank account feed, and that derives from Sage Common Syndication feed of type bank account feed entry. So that's the bank account feed entry class that we created before, that we looked at before. So as I say, that's all boilerplate code. You don't really need to worry about it. I just wanted to give you a quick demo there of what was being generated for us. There's a lot of classes and a lot of useful stuff in there, but we'll just be using them as objects, as I say, so you don't really need to worry about them. The other thing which the Visual Studio 2 plugin does do for us as well is to create us a little sample class here, just to demonstrate how you could make a request. So we could just call this class directly and call the get, or we could call the get feed method of this class, and it would execute and return the list of bank accounts from the providing application. In this case, accounts 50. So it would go to this endpoint, make that request. It would deserialize those back into bank account feed entries, and then we'll just iterate over the collection and output them. And I'll show you from scratch how to do this. So I'll just close some of this down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the demo because I don't need that. We'll be creating it from scratch. But what I will need to do, so I'll just go into the properties of the console application. I'm going to change it to use the full framework. We will need to do that, unfortunately. So we'll go back to our console app. So all we've done is we've generated a lot of boilerplate code at this point. So what we want to do first of all is start making a request for some data. So here I'll use trading accounts because they're a good example of a rich object. Trading accounts in accounts 50 terminology would be both customers and suppliers. In terms of the GCRM contract, it's the generic term which covers both of those types of information. So I'm going to set up a GET request here. So I'm going to go off to accounts and say, please give me all of the trading accounts that you have there. So first thing I'll do here is I'm going to create an SData URI. Oops. SData, and that's in the Sage Common Syndication namespace. We just new that up, and I'm going to call a helper method on that called build local path. Now in the hard-coded sample that we saw generated before, you saw there was a URL, so just literally the full string. Now there's a lot of configuration information which might change. So it might not be that string by default. You might be running on a different port. You might have SSL enabled, so you're going through HTTPS. So you can't rely on a hard-coded path always being correct. There's various bits of information which do need to be discovered, even down to the local machine name. Using localhost is fine for demo purposes, but doing it for in a real-world scenario is never a good idea. So what I'm going to do here is call this build local path helper method, and this will go off and build that URL for me. It'll get me to the same string as we saw before in this particular example, but it does actually read the configuration information, and should that be different, the URL that I end up with would take all of that into account, and I don't really need to worry about it. The only thing I need to do here is tell it the very basic information that of what I want to connect to. So this takes an array of strings as a parameter. So we're going to be connecting to the accounts 50 adapter. In there we're going to be connecting and using the GCRM contract, and within there we're going to go off and get the default data set. Now you should pause at this point and just point out here the default data set identifier there, which is a dash. Again, this is something which is fine for demo purposes, but in a real world scenario I would not use this here. It's definitely something I would go off and discover, or I would have a bit of UI which the user chooses a particular data set. The problem with the default data set, or the thing which can trip you up, is that it can change. It's just in terms of the accounts 50, it's just the very first data set in the list, and should you add others and delete the one that you had, then you could be talking to a different endpoint. So it's just something to watch out for. Fine, as I say, fine for demo purposes, but normally you would use the full GUID in there, which would uniquely identify the data set. And within the data set, when we get there, as I say, I'm going to be using trading accounts. So I'm going to go to the trading accounts collection. So what that will have done is basically internally built up that URL, so http://localhost:/accounts50/GCRM/dash/trading account. But I didn't have to worry about getting all that configuration information. So now that I've got a URI that I can use, I want to go and hit that URL and retrieve data. So to do that, I'm going to create an SData request. that's in the Sage Integration Client namespace, so I'm just going to import that namespace. Again, this is defined in the SIF, and this wraps up all of the different types of requests you can make. Every single one can be made through an SData request object. I'm just going to call that request. I'm just going to call the new SData request. So I'm going to new it up, and what I'm going to pass into that request is the URI from the SData URI that I previously generated. So I'll get the URI property from it. That's all I need to pass into that. And then I'm going to set the username and password property. So when you're connecting to SData feeds, invariably there will be locked down in some manner depending on the particular implementation, so you will very typically have to authenticate against it. They're not just open to anybody to be able to go and hit. You have to log on, you have to authenticate, and you'll authenticate typically as the application user. So in here, as we're going to be talking to Sage 50 accounts, we're going to log on with the default username and password, which is manager and no password. So that's our request ready to go. So what we're going to do is request a list of trading accounts. So we're going to get a list of trading accounts back from this request. So we need an object to contain that. So So we create an instance of a trading account feed, a collection of trading accounts. Now this is one of the boilerplate classes that were generated before. That's in the CRM ERP X 2008 feeds namespace. That namespace is generated from the schema. I should point out there. So we'll just call that account, and we'll just new it up. So this is going to contain our collection. So all we'll do is we'll just say request feed, and that's generic. I'm going to get it for trading account feed entry. So what we want, so we're going to go and hit the URL that we built before. We're requesting trading account, my mistake. Trading account feed entry, and the parameter we're going to pass into that is the trading account feed, the collection that we created earlier there. And then all we do is call request.send, and that will go off and hit that endpoint. It will read the request, it will authenticate because we've given it a username and password. It will populate that account variable that we created there, that collection, with the list of trading accounts, with the results of what we're going into, or what has been returned by accounts there. So all we'll do here now is say, if the request is status valid for verb, so we're just doing a very basic check just to make sure that everything was okay. I'll show you later on in the demo how you can get more information if things do go wrong, and how you can actually handle those situations. Here it's just a very simple Boolean flag, which is just telling us, did we get the expected result? The expected result varies depending on the request type that you're making, whether you're doing a get request, a put request, a post, etc. So here we could have got a 404 example, for example. So as a file not found. In this case, it would be a 200 OK request that we will actually get returned. So we'll just do that very basic check, and now that we've got that, we will just say let's do a for each, and it's going to be for each trading account feed entry in accounts, And all we'll do here is we'll just output it to the console. Just do a quick string format here, just. That's account. And these are all the properties that, again, this comes from the boilerplate code. As you see, we're just using using these objects here. And we'll just put a little pause in there. So if we now run this, we'll go and build it, and we get an error. What did I miss? Sorry, it's the entries collection that we need to be iterating over here. So I'll just run this, that will build. It'll go off now and it'll hit the feed. There'll be a slight delay as we actually build this information, but here, if you're familiar with Sage 50 accounts, you'll recognise some of the names here that were of the customers and suppliers which are in there. So that's got us our list of trading accounts in there. I'm just getting a key to come out of that. So that's getting information. It's as simple as that. A handful of lines of code. Getting other types of information would literally be a change to the types that we use here, the trading account feed and the actual endpoint that we go to. Now, what I've done here is actually something which wouldn't be considered particularly good practice. I've just gone off and got everything. Now, in this particular case, we're using the demo data for Sage 50 accounts, and there's not very much data in it, but there's only, I think it's 45 trading accounts in there, which isn't very much at all. But there could be thousands, tens of thousands of records in your endpoint that when you go and hit it, and you don't necessarily want the overhead of going off and getting all of those records at once. You want to normally do some form of paging and only get just enough records to fill a screen for display, and you only get the next ones as and when you need it. So normally what we'd do for that is we'd actually just get from a certain number of records to a certain number, and we'll get the count of those. So here what I could do is I could just quickly change this to say UI dot count, and we're going to set that to 10 records, and I can set the start index to 10 as well. So what that's saying is that we're going to go 10 records in, and we're going to get the next 10 records from there. So if I run that again, we can see we're getting a much smaller list. It was much quicker to return the data. We didn't have to go off and build a big long list. So typically in a real world situation you would get them in page sizes. The actual page size that you use would really be dependent on the endpoint that you're requesting and what you're going to do with them when you actually retrieve them. If you've got a screen which only displays 5 items, then it's they only go off and get 5 items. If you've got one which displays 50 items, then go off and get all 50. It's really down to your implementation, and it's sort of a very touchy-feely sort of thing as to how you would decide how you'd get to a point of deciding how many you would get in a page. Everything here that you're seeing will work on any other resource kind. It's literally the difference is with the trading account feed entry. That would just be invoice feed entry, a sales invoice feed entry. It could be a purchase order feed entry, so on and so forth. There's anything which is supported by the adapter. All of those types were generated as boilerplate code. We didn't have to rewrite them. We just had to write a handful of lines of code to do our particular requested operation. It's all very similar code that you, as you'll have seen if you followed through the examples. So that's getting information, and very simple, as you can see. So once we get something, we're going to want to do something with that. So we're going to want to make some changes. So we'll go off and we want to go off and get a trading account, and we'll actually make a change to that trading account, update the name, update the address, so on and so forth.